Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 1 of our 6th season. We're kicking it off with aliens invading.
So yes, as Lisa just said, this is episode 1 of season 6, which is pretty cool to say. Thank you, listeners, for sticking with us this long, and we hope you enjoy this season as much as we think you will. We're looking forward to some of the themes that we're going to be talking about, especially our theme that we're kicking off today, and that is alien invasion, which I think we've probably talked around or mentioned different aspects of alien invasion, but we've never focused on this particular theme. But before we get started talking about alien invasion, we want to follow up on something that we kind of teased in our last mini and our last main, actually. So one of the things we're doing in season 6 is we wanted to kind of reinvent the podcast in some ways, or look at stuff that we felt like needed to be updated. And one of those things was our artwork, the images that we use, like the thumbnails on different podcatchers that you look at when the episode is playing, or the images we use on our social media like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. And so we did commission some artwork from Lynn Hanson, who's an extremely well-known and talented horror book cover artist. And we really enjoy her artwork. I actually have one of her pictures actually in my den. It's kind of a Halloween haunted house picture that I love. And we are just so happy with the images that she has created for us. And so if you haven't noticed it already, you will quite soon. We are trying to bring out the images in conjunction with this beginning of season 6. So we will be unveiling those on our social media. And we really hope that you enjoy them. We love them. So we hope you do too. And then eventually at some point, our next step that we want to tease a little bit here is, now that we're updating the artwork and some other stuff, we are going to hopefully have some merch available for listeners. So t-shirts, that sort of thing. And so that is something that we are working on as well, that we're super excited about. But this episode is going to be on alien invasion. So I will kind of move us from these really cool announcements about what's going on with the podcast globally, kind of housekeeping stuff. And let's start talking about alien invasion. We have a bunch of different episodes, and I know we kind of talked about the Orson Welles radio broadcast of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds and that whole kind of history of that, which seems pretty important. But there are just so many movies and books that feature alien invasion that we have in our list here that we may touch upon. But I feel like before we get into really specific examples, that maybe we should do like we've done before, and that is at the beginning of our series, talk just a little bit about why this is something that is so scary. Lisa, Matt, does either of you want to start us off with like why you think this particular trope is something that pops up so much in dark sci-fi and horror?
Sure, I can jump in. Well, I mean, as we've been getting ready for season 6, and when we kind of came up with this as our first topic, I know that's something we typically do in kind of the first episode, is what makes this theme that we're talking about scary. And so I've given it a lot of thought, probably more than maybe I should have, because I've just been thinking about it a lot, to be honest. But I think part of it really comes from the invasion side of it, that it's this external force that's coming in and attacking us. And in a lot of the alien invasion stories that I can think of, and War of the Worlds is one of the ones that springs to mind, but also Independence Day. There's lots of other examples. I think one of the big like hallmarks of that alien invasion story is that they typically are an advanced alien race. I mean, they don't show up and are just using slingshots to attack us. They usually have, you know, advanced weaponry. This is not just a sentient race, but one that has technology that allows them to travel in space at speeds that, you know, apparently we're not able to. And so that, you know, clearly they have more advanced technology all around, which means more advanced weaponry. And I think that is one of the things that is really scary about that idea of, I mean, what do you really do in the case of this foe that is seemingly unstoppable? And a lot of times, I mean, I think Independence Day is, as I mentioned, was a great example. It's kind of, you know, the scrappy underdog humans find a way, they find a weakness, they find that one thing that they can exploit and end up turning the tides to win. But I've always wondered, in particular, with Independence Day, what would have happened, and this would have been like an interesting, you know, alternate storyline or something, or some sort of fan fiction. What would have happened if we hadn't? What would have happened if the aliens had just continued on? Would they have wiped out all of humanity? I can't. It's been a while since I've actually seen Independence Day, so you'll have to forgive me if I don't remember their exact reason why they came. I think they come for the resources and just use them all up until the planet's gone and move on to the next one, something like that. But I think I mean, you've got that advanced technology that we just don't stand a chance against, and then also just, as I kind of said at the very beginning, just that idea of being invaded in particular. Like, there's a reason why alien invasion movies were really popular during the 1950s at the height of the Cold War. I mean, it's a metaphor for, you know, the tension that we were feeling in the Cold War with Russia and that fear of Soviet invasion. And I would even say that you could draw a similar parallel between something like Red Dawn and some of the alien invasion movies. I mean, that's a movie that took place in the 80s that was about a Soviet and Cuban invasion of the United States. And I think thematically they have a lot of overlap between each other. So for me, I think those are the two big things, that this advanced technology that we don't stand a chance against, but also just in general, that sense of our place, our homes, our lives being invaded and turned upside down by this aggressor that wants to completely change the way we live, if not outright exterminate us.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points, Matt. And they were things that I had thought about as well. So when we were thinking about wanting to do like this new series, immediately I don't even remember how it came up, but aliens came up, and I thought, how have we not discussed this in depth? And when you talk about alien invasion stories, I feel like there are two distinct camps of these type of stories, and I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit of each over the course of the series. But one is that kind of big, like, aliens come down to Earth and it's like an immediate war. So, you know, War of the Worlds, which we're going to talk about in this episode, but also, you know, one of my personal favorites, Mars Attacks, which we've actually talked about as part of one of our Summer of Sci-Fi a few years back, either season 1 or season 2. I don't remember which one. You know, but those, I think, kind of to what you're talking about, Matt, talk about this like bigger than life enemy, this seemingly insurmountable odds against us that somehow we kind of rally against together. And I think those usually, Matt, you mentioned like the 1950s and these kind of Cold War fears. And I think these narratives do pop up in wartime because they're convenient metaphors for, you know, one country invading another, or like fears of that. And certainly like fears of like atomic bombs and nuclear fears, and the idea that destruction could be worldwide. Yeah, I see all of those. Like those, you know, metaphors are there, of course. But then there's also the personal alien invasion stories where which I think we'll probably talk about a little bit more in later episodes. But these stories where, you know, one person or just a couple of people are taken by aliens or encounter aliens, is kind of like Close Encounters type of scenario. And that is a different type of fear. It's related to the first one because it's still that like that enemy that you can't really fight against, because you're always going to be the lesser being. You're always going to be the weaker one. You're always going to be the one who's ill prepared for what's happening. But it is a lot about a loss of control, which I think the first one is about too, because I think that's one of the big fears, is that you could be living your life and then suddenly it is completely and utterly disrupted by forces that you didn't see coming. So I think those are kind of two different things. One thing I also want to bring out that you said, Matt, was this idea that like our life here or humanity might in some way be changed by an alien invasion. And I think that's really important because when you look at some of the earliest ones, so if you're, this is obviously coming a lot later than War of the Worlds, which again, we'll talk about. But if you look at the ones in the 50s, which there was a whole spate of them that came rather quickly. So I'm thinking of Williamson's The Liberation of Earth and Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End, which, Matt, I know you're probably more familiar with Childhood's End, so hopefully you can add something to it. But each of these have like an alien species that comes and lands on Earth. So with The Liberation of Earth, it's more of people looking back on things that have happened over and over again. So basically, like one alien race will land and take over, and then there's a liberation by another alien race, but then that race just kind of takes over, and that happens over and over and over again until Earth and its people are just kind of mainly used up. But Childhood's End is something that I think is a little bit of a standout because it does talk a little bit more about like a peaceful type of alien coming down to Earth. Now, I should note that they apparently are very scary looking because they look kind of demonic. But one thing that I find fascinating with like Childhood's End is that even the peaceful ones change humanity in ways that are completely unexpected and that really end the idea of humans, because the children start to change and then the children are separated because they're becoming something new and different. And I think that really, when you're nailing down a fear of alien invasions, I think that really, for me, gets to the core of it. It's the idea that something could come down to Earth and have such an enormous impact that in some way we cease to be human. So not just like the loss of our planet or like the loss of our freedom or the loss of a control, but almost the loss of humanity, which I don't know, that to me is a pretty unique fear that has to do with these alien invasion stories, especially the earliest ones. I don't know. Am I really far off with that, or does that make sense?
Well, no, I was actually thinking another example of using as an alien invasion movie is that classic John Carpenter movie, They Live, which is pretty much exactly in line with what you're talking about. It's a subtle secret infiltration of the human race that only Rowdy Roddy Piper is able to find out with the sunglasses that he has that lets him see them for what they truly are. But I think that's the horror behind that movie, is that what if there is this secret cabal that is pushing humanity in a specific way to basically undermine us and rob us of our individuality or freedom or whatever. And I can maybe mention more about Childhood's End, but I think the one thing is, if for those of you that haven't read it, I mean, it is Arthur C. Clarke. It is far more hard sci-fi than it is a horror novel, but and he's really exploring this idea of, I guess, peaceful invasion, as it were. There are some hints that these aliens have actually visited humanity prior to their big revelation in the beginning of the novel. But I do agree with you that that idea of this external force that changes us and could possibly rob us of what makes us human is a really scary thing. Childhood's End is not meant to be a horror story. It doesn't have any like truly scary moments, but if you think about it from that perspective, it can be an unsettling or scary notion for sure.
Yeah, I definitely think from what you both are saying, which those are all things that I've thought about as well. There seemed to be this kind of like external or internal version of alien invasion based on what the author's trying to get across. Like, in War of the Worlds, it's kind of, I mean, it's pretty much, it was kind of speaking about countries going and taking over other countries that they viewed as less powerful. And so, one of the characters says to the Martians, we're just edible ants in both Wells's versions. And this idea that, yeah, I mean, what is humanity if you have an external alien invasion? Like, the people start doing what they previously would have thought of as like savage things just to survive. And then what does it even mean to be human? Like, what's the future of humanity in those sorts of situations if you're like under an alien race, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And then the infiltration side, which I guess is more in like maybe anytime you're dealing with like, Cold War type politics, particularly at like a lot of 1950s ones are kind of the infiltration idea that you were mentioning, Matt, like invasion of the body snatchers and the pod person idea where people just start acting a little weird, like the uncanny, but you don't know quite what's going on. Or John Wyndham, who we've talked about with the Triffids, but in 1957 did the Midwich Cuckoos, which of course became a couple incarnations of the Village of the Damned, where aliens come and zap everybody, and while everybody's unconscious, they impregnate the women, all of them, so that they all give birth to these children that aren't quite, they're like, I guess, hybrids or something. And I don't think they ever fully understand what the aliens wish to accomplish there. It's been a while since I read the book, but I really enjoyed it. And he also did the book, The Kraken Wakes, which is an external invasion where, yeah, I mean, that's people from the bottom of the ocean, but invading. And so it seems like there's like an external, like, this is a big war, like we're just being attacked and we can't quite understand. Or it's like the alien is getting inside us somehow, which is also pretty insidious and creepy as well. And both, I think, make us question our humanity. And the other thing I was thinking of too is like the alien is like the ultimate other, if you're thinking of like monsters in that way as well. The idea of the individual from like outer space. I mean, it's all of our fears, like cosmic horror, the weird, something that not even of this earth other, and we can't really communicate with it. Like the day the earth stood still, if I remember right, there was like communication issues there seems to be always communication issues unless you're in Star Trek and you have a universal translator or something. And I think that's terrifying as well, because you don't know what's going on. You may know they're violent or you may know they're infiltrating, but you don't quite know why. And I think that's terrifying. And I also wonder if there's this tension that of many things we think of as horrific, I don't know that we can necessarily say that aliens are like 100% like not going to happen. I mean, I suppose there's a possibility that there could be aliens, and if aliens have the technology to come to us, which I don't know if that's given or not. People argue about whether that's possible because it would take so long and so much power, etc. If they came, we don't know how friendly they would be or how friendly we would be to them. It definitely would be a game changer. I mean, it would be like what we went through with the pandemic to a certain way. There'd be life before it and life after it. And I wonder if, like a lot of scary things, there's like a little bit of like fear of the unknown or what could happen in real life, even though I'm just reading or watching this fictional version of this.
Yeah, I would agree with that fear of the unknown and that otherness. It is definitely a huge factor. I mean, when we think about a lot of when I think about at least a lot of the alien movies, even creature features or other alien movies, I mean, they're always made to be, I mean, very often they have some sort of humanoid shape or form because in a lot of cases it's actors playing them. But as technology has gotten better, it's definitely given us better special effects where we can have extremely non-humanoid aliens, which I think does lend to that strange uncanniness and in particular uncomfortableness of especially if you recognize that, this is a superior intellect. I mean, I even think of that movie while you were talking. I was thinking of that movie, The Arrival. I think that's the name of it. The one with, oh, I can't think of her name, but where the whole point is that there is an actress, and do you all know what movie I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, I know. Arrival, yeah, where she's like a linguist and you need
Yes,
her to help
yes,
them
thank
learn
you.
the aliens' language. Yeah, I really
Yes,
enjoyed that movie.
thank you. And Amy Adams, that it was like on the tip of my tongue. Like I could see
Yes,
her,
yes.
but I could not think of her name. But yeah, like I think of that kind of a movie. A lot of the tension in that movie, because it is a very tense thing of how are we going to overcome this language barrier? How are we going to show these aliens that yes, we are friendly, we do want peace? How do we communicate that to something that clearly has a language, but communicates in ways that we just completely don't comprehend? I mean, it's not like we can sit and look at the roots of their words or anything like that. I mean, it's really that figuring out how to communicate, and that really does bring out that extreme otherness, like you were talking about, Mel. That this is an intelligent species that is so far beyond our comprehension that it is nothing like us. And what if they don't think of or view the world in the same way that we do? I mentioned actually in our last mini episode that we recorded, we did a round of recommendations, and one of the books that I recommended is one that I've recently finished about a month and a half ago, called Children of Time. And it's a hard sci-fi novel. I mean, it's not horror at all, but one of the things that it charts is kind of this devolution of human society while there's a coexisting evolution of intelligent spiders. And there's a whole premise behind it. I can get into it, but the whole point of it, and what's really fascinating in the chapters that are from the point of view of these spiders that are evolving and becoming sentient, is that because of the way they view the world, their concepts of things are completely alien to humans. And like because their language is based more on tapping their legs than it is speech. When the very first time they encounter humans, they think that they're just these dumb oafs because they can't understand what the spiders are saying, because they can't comprehend the idea of speech being something that is verbal and audible. So it's more gestures and taps. So I don't know. I mean, that idea of otherness, like how do you overcome something like that, and how do you coexist with something like that once you've encountered each other? I mean, like you said, Mel, unless it's Star Trek where we've got that MacGuffin, the universal translator, it really is a huge hurdle of figuring out, well, how do we find even common ground so that we can determine, hey, we want to coexist and we have similar goals. What if you don't at all? And that's a scary question. What if you meet a peaceful alien species, but their goals are completely different from ours in terms of, and they don't care about the value of human life?
Yeah, those are really good questions and really terrifying things. And I think, I think they play out our fears that we have every day just in humans trying to interact with other humans. That I feel like these alien stories sometimes could be really good fables, not just of something that this is something that's like literally from space, which is something we can't ever fully understand, and it's something completely foreign or different from us as just human beings. But I think it's also like an interesting symbolic way of looking at the tensions we have amongst ourselves as human beings. Often it's interesting to see what happens to the humans when they meet aliens. Does the world band together in world peace and for once to fight against the aliens, or do the aliens teach us how to be more peaceful? Do we treat the aliens like we treat other people at times? Are the aliens treating us that way? I mean, now we have this spate of like the earth has been kind of destroyed. We need to go colonize another world. What if the aliens in your story are coming to colonize Earth? I think, as all fiction is, we play out real life fears and horrors through fictional things. And it's not always, it is that cosmic horror, I think, and the ultimate other and the uncommunicable aspect of it. But yeah, it's definitely a nifty way of playing out the fears that we don't really think about when we're afraid of another human. But when it's like this monstrous alien thing, it becomes kind of a way to turn that around and kind of look at it in a way that maybe we don't otherwise.
I love all of this that y'all have been saying in it. I'm really curious, Mel. I know you said you had some thoughts on War of the World, and I kind of feel like that's where we need to start in talking about. I mean, we've really already started about like why this is so terrifying, but when we're looking at the alien invasion story and really its genesis, because it could just be an invasion story, but it's not, right? I mean, this is specifically an alien invasion story. Then you've really got to start with H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. As far as I know, this is where a lot of people, a lot of scholars like pinpoint this is where our modern alien invasion stories come from. I'm not entirely sure on things that predated the H.G. Wells story, which goes all the way back to 1897. Of course, the Orson Welles radio broadcast probably made it famous, or that's one reason why a lot of people still talk about it, which didn't happen until later, until 1938. But Mel, I'm curious to know just kind of what you know about H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, and what that can kind of, how it might inform some of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an H.G. Wells expert. I know I read The War of the Worlds a while back because I was interested in it. And when I was reading a lot of sci-fi stuff. And so I kind of brushed up on the plot a little bit because I knew we were thinking about talking about the 1938 radio broadcast and some of the stories that came out around that. But yeah, from everything I've seen, War of the Worlds is kind of the earliest like alien invasion story. I mean, I'm sure there could be something earlier, or there could be something almost like maybe like metaphorical or gesturing at it, but it seems like this is kind of the one that people think about when they think about alien invasion. And, you know, some of the stuff that happens in it, I feel like it's very, I mean, basically, like we're here on Earth doing our own thing, wrapped up in our own conflicts. And it's almost like a military. I mean, it's like a guy observing almost like military maneuvers. Like, what would happen if if they kind of treated almost like a country invading England. And so the Martians start dropping off these little cylinders in different rural areas where they know, I guess they figure there's not going to be a lot of resistance. And they come out of them, and they have, every time, if I remember right, every time they thought they had them beat because of gravity, they would create like these, I was listening to one of the chapters on audiobook recently, and then it was like they would have these weird machines that they would make really fast with their tentacles, and that would defeat the gravity problem. So yeah, I mean, it was just like they had better technology. They had better methods of invasion and war. It was interesting to me because I felt like it kind of anticipated the carnage of World War One. I mean, there was just like trench building at one point, and the heat ray is destroying everything. And so I think it gives us, I mean, I feel like it gives us a lot of the themes we already talked about. I mean, the Martians are like weird blobs with tentacles and scary eyes, and they just kind of flop around because they can't handle gravity. And then they turn themselves kind of into robots with their weird machinery. And so they're the complete other. People can't communicate with them at all. It's just constant killing because they're basically they're invading, they're taking over the world. There's not much of a war, actually, when I think about it. And so you have this almost like documentary aspect of it. And then in the second half, it has a little bit of what we were talking about, where like life is never the same. Because I mean, and this is all taken like almost verbatim for the radio broadcast, but the idea of like, what will human society be now? Like, are we still human? Like, what is our purpose? And yeah, I feel like advanced technology, the ultimate other that you cannot communicate with or understand, and then like Matt said earlier, if you find out that there's somebody that's way technically advanced than you and they want your planet, what the heck can you do about it? And then what does that mean about you? Like, there's a lot of talk about like the people who used to like go to restaurants or have like white collar jobs or whatever. Like, that's all gone now. Like, how are we going to survive? How do we get food? How do we keep the roving animals from killing us? Like, life just completely turns on its head, which I thought was interesting for something written in the Victorian time period to be basically like thinking about the end of the world or like annihilation. But yeah, I feel like in a way it's got like all the things that we've been talking about in that one story. And then of course Orson Welles and his team changed it to America and focused way more on like news broadcast type aspects and having one person talking the whole time to kind of update it for the 30s. But yeah, it definitely, I think, is kind of like, it's not just the granddaddy of all these things, but it also kind of laid down, I think, some of these aspects that keep getting played out over and over again. And I'm sure, I mean, I'm no historical expert, but there was a lot of like nationalism, and that was, I mean, it was basically like in the run up to what was going to become World War One. So the early, you had a lot of colonization going on and the British Empire and all that. And I'm sure that there's also comments upon that as well that was going on in the book.
Well, I think all those themes are really, really, really interesting and really kind of pertinent to what we've been talking about. I have not read War of the Worlds. And I will say I haven't read it in its entirety. I've read snippets of it kind of here and there when I was doing some research for something else. And I kind of glanced over it again tonight before our recording. I haven't read it. I should. I should, just based on everything that you're talking about. I am much more familiar with the Orson Welles radio broadcast of it, which happened, of course, in 1938. And I did re-listen to that. I had heard it before, and then before we jumped on this recording, I listened again. Which, listeners, you can find it on YouTube if you search just the Orson Welles War of the World. It's pretty fun to listen to. I don't know, it's just a fun production, and there's a lot that I guess people know about War of the Worlds. And I think that one of the most famous things is not the story itself, but the idea that this broadcast somehow sent the world into chaos. That, American listeners, that this was the story I always heard anyway, was that American listeners, when they were hearing the broadcast for the first time, like they were in their homes and they had turned on the radio to listen to some show, and they caught this broadcast and thought that it was real, and it just, people were running out of their homes, and people were trying to escape or figure out what was happening. I remember one particular story I heard of people who had were in their cars driving and had turned it on in the middle of it and not realize that it was that it was actually a radio play, and absolutely flipped out and thought that they were actually under attack. I have always loved those stories. I don't know why, but there's just something that I think is really fascinating to me in the way that art can affect people. But in looking at this, it's really kind of fascinating to think about that could even happen, because number one, radio broadcasts were very they were a popular form of entertainment, and these sort of kind of radio plays were something that people were used to listening to. So that right there, I think, should send up the first red flag that probably these stories we've heard are not quite true. But NPR did a really good kind of article on it about if War of the Worlds actually started a panic or didn't. And again, a lot of these stories talk about how, and they quote Radiolab here when they say that there were 12 million people who were listening when Welles' broadcast went out over the airway, and about 1 in 12 thought it was true. And so if that was the case, then that would mean 1 million people, which is a lot, thought that it was true, and that at least some percentage ran out of their homes. And Radiolab said that would constitute, quote, a major freak out. But apparently when people really started digging into this, they found out that they don't think that was quite the case. They think, number one, that the audience who actually listened to it was much smaller, and that even fewer than that would have panicked or thought it was real. So one of the things that they pointed out is that the program was actually scheduled against another show called, it was at the same time, like on a different channel, called Chase and Sanborn Hour, which was a ventriloquist who did this like comedy variety show. Apparently that was one of the most popular programs at the time. And so they were like, just based on that fact alone, people were not really tuning in to hear War of the Worlds. Everybody was listening to this. And then they also said that at the time, a rating service was phoning households to do like national rating surveys, because obviously that's how they would have to do them, to find out what program people are listening to. And only 2% answered that they were listening to the radio play or the Orson Welles program, but that none of them indicated that they thought they were listening to something true or like a news type broadcast. So a very small percentage of people probably actually listened to it later. But then that just kind of brings about the question, for me at least, is like, why we have this story that seems, I mean, like I said, I knew about this story before I even had read parts of War of the World or listened to the broadcast itself. It was one of these things that I was just like, oh, everybody panicked. That's how afraid everybody was. To me, it's fascinating just to think, like, why would we have this like almost urban legend folklore growing about War of the Worlds? And I think that is one of the things that, I don't know, at least for me, gets it. Apparently, some of the newspapers later after the broadcast kind of played into this. And part of that was because they wanted to discredit radio as a source of news. This is something that Slate in an article talked about. So basically, it was this like weird fight between like the newspapers being the main source of news and radio, and they were trying to discredit. And so they used this like War of the Worlds as proof. I'm using my air quotes when I say that, but proof that it was kind of the fake news of the day, and that it had convinced Americans that they were under attack, and, you know, panic ensued. So it was more of like a cooked up story by the newspapers. And then that just kind of grew from there, this legend, this like great legend of Orson Welles. I also kind of wonder if Welles himself didn't also like that, because it does speak, I think, to his power as a storyteller. If he could tell a story that would, you know, spin the world into chaos. I don't know. I find that really fascinating, that this is such a big story that I feel like everybody's heard. Like, anybody who knows really anything about science fiction, if you say War of the Worlds, that's like the one fact that they know, is that everybody went into a panic and that it probably wasn't true. I don't know. What do you think about this, guys?
Well, for this episode, I also listened to it, and this was my first time listening to the 1938 broadcast. I don't think I'd ever listened to it before. And so I had also, you know, read some of the stuff about how maybe people didn't panic like we thought they did, and maybe there was like this mythology about it, or this kind of sensationalism. You want a good story kind of thing. And it was really fascinating to me, because I was trying to listen to it as if I was a person listening to it then, just to see like what I would think. Because I guess growing up hearing the ideas about how this like threw the world into a tumult, I assumed it was going to sound straight up like a news broadcast. I have to say it was pretty, I mean, I could listen to some of it and really think, especially at the beginning when they're interviewing the professor about this stuff is falling from Mars. I mean, it's practically exactly the same as the book War of the Worlds, but it's America. And, you know, the tentacled creatures of, when you're kind of with a journalist interviewing people, I could see it. But then as it went on, there were things that kind of tipped me off. For one, well, they kept going back to the music, which was, it was realistic and interesting, but I don't know that they would keep doing that. And then the heat ray cutting off the journalists from being broadcasted, that was interesting to me. And I could see how that would be scary. But then it got to, now we're with this National Guard regiment, and now we're with these people getting poisoned by the black smoke, which was something else from H.G. Wells. Welles' story. Or now we're in the airplane with this guy who's shooting at the Martian. And I was like, I don't know. Even now, I don't think in 30 minutes, so many cylinders of the time wasn't working. And when I would pause and kind of think about how there's not enough time for this to happen, and there's no way these people could be communicating with each other, and there's no way we could be in the plane, I was just like, this is a radio play. But I mean, one of the things I read from the Smithsonian about if people did panic, things that were different was Wells cut out stuff that would make it seem more like a play in the beginning, because he wanted to just have broadcasts getting cut off over and over again. So if you just stopped listening, if you got scared, you stopped listening, maybe. And also is the latest intermission. Like the intermission comes in 3/4 of the way through it, when typically they would come a quarter or halfway through. And so it just kept going and going, and there was no intermission. And so the writer of the Smithsonian piece I read about it said that it was speculating that people might have just thought, if it's just broadcasts and there's no music and intermission, or they started listening late, or they missed the part that said it was a radio play. It's a lot of ifs. So I don't know. I don't think that people in 1938 were like more gullible than us. I think they would have known what could have been on a radio broadcast. So I feel like if someone was believing it, they would have had to have missed the beginning and realized there was no intermission coming and gotten creeped out and like just shut it off. Because at the end, it's Orson Welles pretending to be the professor again, like reading his journal. So there's no way that could necessarily, that would be real. It's like days after, it's a couple of days after the invasion. And then at the very end, Wells teases that he wanted to do that episode because it was October 30th, 1938, and he wanted to scare people. So yeah, I mean, this is nothing other than me listening to it and being really interested in hearing how it sounded and what I would have thought. I feel like, yeah, it's probably like some people did freak out because of whatever issue, like they didn't hear all of it, or they didn't hear the parts about it was fiction. But probably most people knew it was a radio play. They probably recognized Orson Welles' voice, because I don't know that there were many channels you could listen to these radio plays. Even if there's a competing one, I think they still probably would have been familiar with it. But it was interesting. It was interesting reading the different interpretations about what people might have thought when they were listening. And I'm glad I listened to it. It was entertaining.
Yeah, it is. I thought it was entertaining when I listened to it. It has, on one hand, well, how do I phrase this? On one hand, it feels, like you said, I was kind of like you. I was like, I don't see how anybody who listened to the whole thing could have thought it was real, just because, yeah, they jump around so much about, I mean, first of all, just scientists seeing like whatever they saw on Mars, like saying they saw like the explosions or the fire, or I don't remember now what they said. They said they were seeing on Mars, but I mean, right there, I think, in the 30s, I don't even think people would have thought like, oh yeah, of course scientists can see what's happening on Mars and like readily, report on it. So I don't think that people who listen to the whole thing, I can see how maybe a handful of people, had they turned it on in the middle of it and only caught a few moments, might have temporarily been a little bit scared, like, what's going on? Because one part that I thought was a lot of fun was how the broadcast tried to make it seem like people were listening to a real broadcast, even though a lot of it, like for reasons I just said, are kind of ridiculous. But there was this attempt to make it feel real, like, now we're going to talk to this person and then every once in a while there'd kind of be music. And so, yeah, I did think it was fun for that reason. Like, it felt to me a bit like time traveling a little bit, and kind of imagining what it would be like to just be listening to the radio and hear this story. And it's a good story. But I'm with you, Mel. I really don't see how people could have honestly been surprised by any of it at all. But yeah, there were enough clues there that I think it's fine. Apparently, just for those of y'all who are interested, there was quite a bit of behind the scenes drama with it. Like, I think Wells really struggled to get the the broadcast put together. It was very low budget. I think like his whole show, I think I mentioned before that it wasn't one of the most popular ones on the radio. And so I don't think they even had a sponsor at that point. And I think they struggled in just recording it and making it sound the way they wanted to. And so that almost, to me, even makes it that much funnier to think that people would have taken it or mistaken it for something authentic, because to me it very much sounds like it's recorded in a sound studio by people, but it's still fun. It's fun to listen to. So
Yeah, I mean, even when it's even when I feel like, oh, this is pretty realistic, I still feel like it's people making it sound that way and not, acting, and not real. I also thought it was interesting that the guy who was tasked to write it just kept saying he couldn't do it. He couldn't get it done in time because the original material drug too much, and he couldn't figure out how to turn it into a radio broadcast. Which I could see that, having read. I mean, nothing against H.G. Wells. It's an amusing plot, but I was listening to different audiobook parts of it to kind of remind myself of what I'd read a while ago. And the narrator goes off on. He's a philosopher, not a scientist, and he goes off on these like long things, speculate. There's just long periods of time where you're kind of like, I wish something was happening and I was with other people. And so the writer in some ways kind of chose that broadcast method with Wells as like a way, let's make this more dramatic. And so I thought that was interesting because I mean, I had no trouble listening to the 1938 broadcast. It kept my attention, even though I was constantly thinking of the possible panic. So I thought that was kind of funny that, like you said, it's not only just like we have a shoestring budget and we're not that popular right now because we didn't have this sensational thing happen. We got to put this together and make it sound believable. But it's also like, how do I make this material? Like they were trying to figure out how to make the material interesting to their audience, and then they end up supposedly traumatizing their audience. So I just thought it was an interesting, their problems ended up like not being problems. Like they somehow surmounted them. But the way that they surmounted the issue of it dragging by turning it into like this like whipping back and forth between different broadcasts or whatever was the very thing that people claimed set off the panic. Which, Orson Welles did okay. He kind of was really cagey, so he wouldn't get sued or whatever. But then he ended up doing Citizen Kane, and like the rest is history. So the whole thing kind of helped him more than hurt him, which I also thought was really interesting. It just seems like a lot of good publicity and marketing and luck than maybe the big panic that we think it was, or the kind of folk tales about it make it sound like.
Yeah, it's really kind of fascinating that we're sitting here, I mean, gosh, so many years later, talking about a radio broadcast that could have been and should have been a flop. I mean, just based on like ratings alone. And yet we're talking about it simply because a rumor started about it that caused it to live on in infamy. So yeah, I think you're right. I think Orson Welles handled the kind of bad publicity that came afterwards really well and was very careful with it. But I also think it was just a huge amount of luck on his part that he was able to kind of spin it in the way that he did. Well, I think that I mean, we start off talking about alien invasions and we end up talking about Orson Welles and his luck. I think that's a good place for us to kind of stop this first introduction to our alien abduction series. We will have a couple more episodes where we'll really go more in depth into some of the more classic movies and texts. We just kind of wanted to spend this time talking about War of the Worlds, since it was such an important beginning point for this narrative, and just kind of talk a little bit about some ideas about why alien invasions are a ripe ground for horror. So I'm going to just say that that's it for today, and I hope you join us for the rest of the episodes. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we are doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content, or simply rate and review us, which is entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us. Theme music is used with permission by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.